Well, hello again, everybody. Coming back to you again, doing a part two of my follow-up on the video I made earlier about critical race theory in the Southern Baptist Convention. In that video, I said I was going to do a follow-up on Voddie Baucham's book, Fault Lines, the Social Justice Movement and Evangelicalism's Looming Catastrophe. This book is everywhere right now. It's on the New York Times #1 bestseller list. Christians pretty much everywhere are buying this book like it's candy, and there's a whole bunch of people, singing its praises, saying how wonderful it is. I think there's some wonderful things in it. Excuse me. I think there's also some very bad things in it. So as a Christian and as a pastor and as a man of God, I don't recommend it as highly as other people do. But I feel there's good and bad in this book. So in this book, I'm going to be talking about it. There's an old saying, don't judge a book by its cover. There's also another saying that I heard a couple years ago. It says, don't actually critique a book that you've never actually read. Don't go by hearsay. Don't go by what other people are saying about it. Make sure you've read it yourself and do the research yourself. So that's what I did. I read Voddie Baucham's book, Fault Lines, and I think there's good and bad in there. So let's go ahead and get into it. Let's talk about the good. The first couple chapters of the book, he talks about his life story, and I really enjoy it. Talks about how he was raised by a single mother in California and how they eventually moved to Texas and stuff like that. And at first I thought this was going to be bad in a sense that he was going to use it as a means to talk about, well, I made it, so therefore since I made it, y'all can make it too. And maybe there was a little bit of that in there, but I didn't really get that. I actually enjoyed his backstory. I enjoyed what he had to say. I think it brought a lot of context to the book, and I actually enjoyed it. It talked about how he played football and how he got a football scholarship, and that's how he was able to go to Rice and the Air Force Academy, and I think it was New Mexico State University, which all that was great. And then his senior year, he quit, and then he went to Houston Baptist. The only question I have for him, though, is what about the kids who can't play football or who can't get a scholarship? What do they do? And he really doesn't answer that, but that's more towards the bad. But anyway, I like his life story, and I'm really glad he included it. I think he did a really good job, too, of defining what critical race theory is and how it's applied in American society today. In my former video, I talk about critical race theory. I agree with this definition. It's basically scholars in the 70s and 80s got together and they said, hey, laws and regulations in this country were basically used to keep black and brown people down and minorities down. And historically, I'm going to show you in this video that that's true. Voddie Baucham kind of takes this, in my opinion, unfair and unbalanced and biased opinion, when I get to the bad, and he basically doesn't cover all the history. So therefore, I don't think he does justice to the definition of critical race theory. And like I said, because of that, he kind of has this throw the baby out with the bathwater approach as if there's no baby in the water at all. And I just can't agree with that. But anyway, he does a really good job of explaining what critical race theory is. And he does a really good job of how it plays out and it's applied in American society today. And I think that's really, really good. He also does a really good job talking about abortion and how he says 35% of all black kids are aborted in this nation. Now, I actually think that statistic might be a little low. I read an article a couple months ago said it's actually 43% of all babies in America that are aborted are African American. And if that statistic is true, that means abortion is literally, figuratively, and literally killing black families in this country. I'm reminded of Dr. Umar Johnson's comments too. Now, granted, Dr. Umar Johnson is very hostile towards Christianity. He's very hostile towards Jesus. He's very hostile towards anything about the Bible and the gospel, so I don't recommend him. But I do recommend this one point that he said. He's basically said homosexuality, transgenderism, and abortion are killing the black family in America. And I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, he's absolutely right. You look at homosexuality, that's taking men away from black women, and therefore, or any women for that matter, and it's killing the ability. Genesis says, be fruitful and multiply. Well, homosexuality is basically taking people out of the gene pool to where the human race cannot populate. The same thing about transgenderism. If you go ahead and get a sex change, you're mutilating the image that God gave you, and you're taking away your ability to procreate by getting all your, if you're a man, getting your, your stuff castrated. So transgenderism is not only mutilating the image of God that God gave you, but you're taking away the ability to be fruitful and multiply to where now you can't. So literally you're taking away your ability to reproduce. And then lastly, abortion, and if you do find a way to, have a heterosexual relationship and produce a baby, if you abort that baby, you're literally killing the black family. If when 35 to 43% of all black babies are aborted in this country. Now I remember when I first read that article, my first thought was, wow, that's not a woman's right to choose. That's black population control. And sure enough, Voddie Baucham, in his book, again, Fault Lines, he talks about how the founding mother, if you will, of Planned Parenthood, when she originally started Planned Parenthood, it was basically on the assumption or on the thought process of black population control. And I was like, wow, if that's true, that's exactly the thought that I had months earlier. So I'm sorry, homosexuality, transgenderism, and abortion are figuratively and literally killing the black family. And by doing that, particularly with the aborted babies part, if you want to rock the vote, if you want to have more people vote and have more power and say in politics or what have you, you need more black population. Well, one of the ways in which you can limit that is by aborting them and not letting babies be in this earth. And so it does act as a form of black population control, and I think that we seriously need to look at that. I think Voddie Baucham has a very powerful and profound point there, and I think Dr. Umar Johnson does too, even though I don't recommend Dr. Johnson. But on this particular point, I think both of them have very good points on that topic. If 35 to 43% of all black babies are the ones who are aborted, that's a staggering statistic. And saints, I think we seriously need to have a conversation about that. He does a great job of highlighting Black Lives Matter, not the movement, but the organization and how corrupt it is, as far as they are a Marxist organizations. And I talk about this in my former video. One of the founding mothers who now resigned from Black Lives Matter, Patrice Cullors, she basically said that they're trained Marxists. Now, for those of you who don't know what that means they're anti-religion. Karl Marx is very famously quoted by saying, religion is the opium of the people, meaning it's the drug of the people which controls people, right? That's why Marxists don't believe in religion. So Marxists are anti-Bible, they're anti-Scripture, they're anti-Jesus, they're anti-Christian, they're anti-God. Okay, so they are a very anti-God organization. They don't believe in God. They don't want anything to do with God. They're also very anti-heterosexual relationships as well. They are against, they used to say they're queer affirming, and which you can do that if you want to, but not to the expense of going against heterosexual relationships, which they are. They're also very much anti-male. Their website used to say, and I say used to say because they changed their website now. They took all this stuff down and they deleted their website. If you go to the Black Lives Matter organization now, it doesn't say this now, but it used to. And before I even read Voddie Baucham's book, I did research on this myself, and sure enough, everything in Voddie Baucham's book, Fault Lines, that he says about Black Lives Matter, the organization, all of it is true. They're anti-male, they're anti-heterosexual, they're anti-Bible, they're Marxist, and they're very much anti-God. So as an organization, in my opinion, we have no business supporting Black Lives Matter, the organization. As Christians, they are the most anti-Christian organization out there. However, Voddie Baucham, I think, does a very bad job because he talks about the violence of some of the protests. And I agree. There was some very violent things, and I agree we should come up against that. However, though, it's fair and imbalanced because he doesn't talk about the peaceful protests that we're doing. I personally know of some pastors, white pastors, who protested during the Black Lives Matter movement, and they were peaceful. They didn't do anything wrong. Everything was great, and nobody wants to talk about that, including Voddie Baucham. And I think that's very fair and unbalanced. So that part of it, I think, was bad. But other than that, I think he does a great job of highlighting the corruptness of Black Lives Matter, the organization. I think his buddy, his friend, John MacArthur, does a very good job of that too. John MacArthur has numerous YouTube videos about that. Just type in John MacArthur and Black Lives Matter on YouTube, and you'll get a full history of it, a lot like what Voddie Baucham says. And he's right. If you did some research on that like I did, you'll see the same things. Glenn Beck also did a very, very good job talking about the finances of Black Lives Matter. And if you give to Black Lives Matter, the organization, where does that money go? Okay, so please feel free to research that with Glenn Beck. I also think he does a great job, and I really love Voddie's boldness. And I'm a fan of Voddie as far as him preaching. He's a bold, non-compromising Word of God preacher, and my God, we need so much more of them today. I absolutely love that, and I really love the fact that he talks about that, and that's why I thank God for his boldness in this book. But you got to be careful with that too, because sometimes we can be boldly wrong, and I'm going to get to that when I get to the bad. But anyway, still talking about the good. He talks about critical race theory is basically not just a tool or an analytical tool. It's actually a worldview. And because of that, he calls it a cult. And the way he writes the book, just like in the book of Genesis, it talks about in the first day God created, in the second day God created, and in the third day God created. He writes the book in the same way when he talks about, on the first day, white people created whiteness. And in the second day, white people created blah, blah, blah. So that's how he writes the book when he describes critical race theory. And I really like what he talks about, on the fourth day, whites invented, white complicity. So therefore, if you voted for Trump or if you are against critical race theory, some people may say that, well, you're just complicit in racism. They just automatically label and say, you might not be a racist, but you're complicit in it. Well, that's not necessarily true. And quite frankly, to label people that is just wrong and racist. And I think Voddie does a really good job of bringing that out. He also talks about this. On the sixth day, white people invented white fragility. So basically, if you're a white person and you feel uncomfortable talking about race, critical race theorists are going to say, well, that's just white people again feeling uncomfortable talking about race. That's just your white fragility coming out. Anytime you hear this, that you know that those people have been indoctrinated into critical race theory. And I can honestly talk about that. That actually happened to me recently in my wife. I was talking to a young African-American man, and he said that to me. He's like, see, that's just, white people feeling uncomfortable talking about race. And I'm like, no, I'm not uncomfortable talking about race. I just don't want to be labeled a racist when I'm not. And automatically I was labeled as white fragility. So when you hear that, that's critical race theory. And I believe Voddie Baucham does a great job of exposing that. The other thing that he does that I really like is, well, how do you know if white people are wrong, then how can white people escape from this? What's the end game? How can we repent enough? How can we be anti-racist enough? Or, how do we make up for the past? Or he basically shows the only way really to do this, according to the critical race theorist, is basically makes us all neo-Marxist and makes us all, socialist, where you basically have wealth and redistribution of power and assets. And that's what he basically says social justice is. Social justice, according to Voddie, is basically neo-Marxism and socialism because it's about power and redistribution. And there's a lot of truth to that, particularly if the government is the people that are going to be the ones that do this. The government says who the power is redistributed to and how the wealth and the assets are redistributed. Then yeah, this does have some socialist aspects to it. And I think he does a really good job of bringing that out. However, my counterpart to that would be, Voddie, isn't that exactly what the rich white people did when they did slavery? I mean, it was about power and economics. It was about power and it was about wealth. And they got more slaves so they could produce more cotton and tobacco. And it was just about wealth distribution. So the more slaves we had, the more wealth we had. So it was about power and redistribution. So you can make the same argument that the slave masters did the same thing. And I'm not saying it's right, because it's wrong. Okay, I'll give you, Voddie, it's wrong. But you have to be careful there, because there's a sense of hypocrisy there, because that's exactly what we in America did the same thing. The very same thing you're accusing of the critical race theory people doing. So if you don't know your history, there's some hypocrisy there. Lastly, last good is he does a really good job talking about ethnic Gnosticism. That's basically talking about, if I'm white, I don't have the capacity to understand racism at the level that a black person would. Now, I agree with that to a point. I'm not black. I'll never know what it means to be black. So there are some nuances. And I'll admit, as a white person, I may have some blind spots to some certain racisms. So amen. I agree with that. But to say I'm completely ignorant and I have no capacity whatsoever to understand racism, that comment is racist in and of itself, okay? And I think Voddie Baucham does a really, really good job of highlighting what he calls ethnic Gnosticism, this secret knowledge that only minorities or black people can know, and white people just cannot understand it, no matter how much we're educated on it, no matter how many we get trained on it, no matter how many classes we get in, no matter how many schools we go to, we're incapable of knowing it. Well, that's just not true. Okay, that we can recognize racism when we hear it and see it. I mean, if we're educated enough on it, we can figure it out. We're not stupid, right? So he does a really, really good job of highlighting that. So that's the good. I think he does a great job of explaining all those things. However, I think there's a lot of bad in this book. Again, I think he's extremely unfair and biased in his presentation. Again, it's almost like he's throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And I'll be honest with you, there are some points where it does come across as black tokenism, because it seems like he's writing this book to a particular audience. And so, and he talks about this in his book. He talks about, how people accuse him of black tokenism, and see, Voddie, that's just you preaching for them white folks again. Well, unfortunately, because he does a very bad job of his scholarship and his history of America's past, he does come across as if he's preaching to a particular audience that already agree with him anyway. So it's almost like this book was written for people that automatically have these views, and Voddie was just kind of throwing him a bone, if you will. That's kind of what this book comes across as. And I'll give you an example, though, of his hypocrisy and his very bad research and how he doesn't connect the dots. On page 29, in his life story, he talks about some black kids who were living in environments exposed to drugs, gangs, and violence, where the norm and they couldn't get out like he did. Because remember, he got out because he played football. And he talks about how these black kids couldn't get out. Well, hello, Voddie, that's systemic racism, the very thing that CRT is trying to expose. On pages 37 and 38, he talks about blacks. This is again, black tokenism. This is one of his statements. He said, blacks in America need to thank God that they were taken to America by white people instead of being sold by the Arabs into the Muslim world. Because in the Muslim world, the slaves were treated even worse than America. How about this, Voddie? How about we thank God for no slavery whatsoever? Because the reality is, okay, yeah, blacks in America might have been treated better, but that's really not something we should be comparing, because blacks in America were beaten, they were castrated, they were killed, lynched, murdered, black women were raped. I mean, come on. Black women who had kids weren't allowed to have their kids be free. If they got pregnant by the masters, now their master's own offspring will be considered slaves. I mean, this is terrible. So to say we need to be thanking God for that, okay, but that's a stretch, brother. I mean, because the reality is black people were treated very, very poorly in this country too. So yeah, they didn't die maybe as bad as the other people, but come on now. You got to realize you're going to get some pushback on that. You're going to get some serious pushback on that, even from white people like me. You're going to get some pushback on that, and so you need to be more careful about that. That's one of the reasons people accuse you, because he talks about this too in his book. He talks about how people accuse him of being an Uncle Tom and a traitor, and you're just preaching for them white folk. Now again, Voddie, I'm not accusing you of that, and I'm not going to accuse you of that. But all I'm saying is you need to understand why people are saying that about you. And you probably do. And it's because of comments like this. You also say in your book that, America is one of the most non-racist countries in all of the world. Voddie, how can you say that when you know the past? I mean, or if you do know that, what made them, if you really do believe that, how did America get good? Because historically, America's always been bad. Between slavery and then Jim Crow and in the civil rights movement, where they were, spraying black people with hoses and the dogs were released on them, and then, and then affirmative action in the 70s that we had to try to make up for all that. And in the late 80s, I remember in my generation, I remember the Rodney King beating, late 80s, early 90s. And then we still got the racial tension to this day. So if you truly believe that, when did America get it right? When did America get good? What event happened in our history that America now figured it out? Because for 400 years we couldn't figure it out. So why are we now suddenly good now? Give me the history of how we're good now. I don't know. I don't know how he did it. He also talks about, we need to thank God because he really said it was the black people portraying other black people And then the white people just took those kidnapped black people, that black people basically betrayed themselves, and the white people brought them over here. Okay, fine, Voddie, that's what you believe, but that doesn't make white people innocent. I mean, they're still just as guilty too. And there was a market for it. And the reason there was a market for it was because of, basically Bacon's Rebellion, which I'll get to it, where all the white indentured servants, they stopped that practice. So therefore, they had to increase their labor force because they couldn't have poor white people anymore. So they got slaves over here. So the reason white people brought slaves over here is because they wanted that labor force, because they got rid of the indentured servant basically contract after the Bacon's Rebellion. So they replaced all that workforce with slaves. So it ain't like white people are innocent here, Voddie. So please don't go there. I mean, that's just very, very bad research if that's what you're trying to do. He also talks about police brutality. And I think he does a pretty good job of showing how not all these killings are racist in nature. But unfortunately, well, for him anyway, he talks about how cops are killing white people too. And he one particular incident that he talks about is Tony Timpa. Tony Timpa was a white person who the cops kneeled on his neck too, just like George Floyd. But they kneeled on his neck even longer. Instead of like 8.5 minutes, it was like 14 minutes. And they killed Tony Timpa too. And he was unarmed and stuff too. He's like, well, but you didn't hear about that story because it doesn't fit the media's narrative of racism and all that. And I agree, it doesn't fit the media's narrative. And that's probably why you didn't hear about it. But unfortunately, Voddie, by giving you all these white people statistics of all the white people that killed by cops, I know you're doing it to try to show that these things are not racially motivated like the media says they are. But really, Voddie, all you did was show that police brutality is a problem. I mean, if cops are killing all these white kids and cops are killing all these black kids, then you're basically saying police brutality is a problem either way. So by showing it's not racially motivated, really what you did was just show that police brutality is a problem, and therefore the police do need to be reformed in some kind of way. Now, I'm not saying it has to be defund the police, and I'm definitely not saying abolish the police, because that's very anarchist, and I'm not an anarchist. So I thank God when I call 911, there's somebody there to help me. But I don't know what the answer to the police reform is, but honestly, Voddie, in your research, you're telling me the police needs to be reformed because cops are killing white and black kids alike. So you're proving that police reform needs to happen because you're proving that police reform is a problem. So again, if you say, hey, there's no more racism in America, which was your point. That's why you bring up the whole police brutality, and it's really not race-related like we say. Then okay, when did America get good? When did it get good? Because I still love America, but I'm not going to sit here and act like America doesn't have a racist past, because it really, really does. So, to go back to the cult of CRT, because he talks about this, and this is where I'm going to get into the Bacon's Rebellion, and this is really the crux, or I'm sorry for the length of this video. I'm sorry for the length of this video, but there's a lot of stuff in here. He talks about how, again, remember on the first day, right? So he says on the first day, white people created whiteness. Well, Voddie Baucham, they did. And you present this as if they didn't, but they did. And this goes all the way back to the Bacon's Rebellion of 1675. What you got to understand is in 1675, there was a lot of people who came over here, and they weren't just slaves. There was poor white people that came over, and they were indentured servants. And basically they promised if you work for 5 to 7 years, you'd come over here, and after 5 or 7 years of serving labor, you'd have the ability to own your own property or own your own land, and you can farm and you can become something yourself. Okay? Well, it turns out, though, that after working all these years, the land they were given really wasn't good land. It wasn't suitable for farming, and it was Native American land, and obviously the Native Americans didn't want them to come and take their land. So a lot of the stuff that they were promised, they were reneging on. So the poor white people and the poor black people united and came together, and they had a revolt led by the name of Francis Bacon. To make a long story short, they burned the Jamestown in Jamestown, Virginia. They burned it to the ground. The governor, William Barclay, basically, because remember, America at this time is a British colony. They reached out to the British and said, hey, we need help. To make a long story short, the Redcoats, the British Army came in, and they wiped out after about a year, they wiped out the rebellion. So Francis Bacon dies of dysentery, and the rebellion dies. Okay, so the Bacon's Rebellion is a failure. However, there are some byproducts to it, though, Voddie. One of the byproducts is, first of all, they got rid of the indentured servants. So now poor white people are no longer indebted. Okay? To make up for that labor force, it increased the slave, the post-Atlantic slave trade. It made the slave trade more because you have to replace that labor force by something since you don't have poor whites. So what do? It increased slavery in America. I was watching a video that said before Bacon's Rebellion, only 7% of the population of Virginia was black. After Bacon's Rebellion, like 30 years later, like 50% of the population of Virginia was black. So the Bacon's Rebellion led even more to the slave trade here in America. Now, what rich white people did is they decided to say, hey, we're not going to have this revolt ever again. We're not going to have poor whites and poor blacks revolt again. So what they did is they enacted the Virginia Slave Code Acts of 1705, which basically said blacks were going to be slaves and their children were going to be slaves as well for all perpetuity. So you could never be free unless the master sent you free. So not only are you a slave, but your children are slaves. Slaves were not allowed to read and write. Slaves were not to have own property. Slaves were not to own any weapons. So all these kind of things. Also, there was interracial laws, which basically said white people couldn't marry black people. And why did they do this? To keep white people white and to keep black people black. Okay? This is the beginning, ladies and gentlemen, of whiteness. And I share this in my other video. The concept of whiteness was a social construct that was made up. It's fake and it's not real. Okay? And Voddie Baucham actually preaches this in one of his sermons where he talks about it's a social construct and it's made up. So I agree with Voddie Baucham on that. But where did the concept of whiteness come about? Because when people came over here before in the 1600s, they weren't classified as white. They were classified by the country of their origin, or they were classified by the tribe or people group in which they associated with. Okay? After the Bacon's Rebellion, this is where the concept of whiteness comes about. Okay? This is where whiteness comes about. And so when he says on the first day, white people created whiteness, Voddie, they did. And they did it as a means of the aftermath of the Bacon's Rebellion. Then he says on day two, white people created white privilege. Voddie, they did. Why? Because after the Bacon's Rebellion, poor whites are no longer indentured. So now poor whites have the ability to own their own land, grow their own crops, and they have the opportunity to become a rich white person. Now, I'm not saying that they will, but they at least have the opportunity to where they could. Okay? Bacon's Rebellion did all this. So now if you're white, you now have an advantage over a black person because a black person has no advantage or no rights whatsoever. Oh, by the way, here's another one of those laws. One of the laws, again, we talk about rules and regulations that were used to keep black people down. One of the laws was a black person was not allowed to bring an accusation against a white person if they committed a crime. So white people could hang black men, torture black men, beat black men, castrate black men, rape black women like nobody's business, and black people were not allowed to take them to court. They weren't allowed to take them to court. Come on now. So you want to talk about critical race theory and the definition of critical race theory, how laws were made in this country? Yeah, that happened, Voddie. That happened, okay? So critical race theory, in my opinion, they got the definition right. Well, my point to all this is this. Voddie Baucham doesn't talk about any of this in his book. Bacon's Rebellion. He says, white people invented whiteness. They did. White people invented the whole concept of white privilege. Voddie, they did. They did, okay? After the Bacon's Rebellion, you now had an advantage for being white that black people didn't have. White privilege was basically started after the Bacon's Rebellion. That's true. Also, he says on the third day, white people invented white supremacy. Voddie, they did, okay? And you can see that after the Civil War, the KKK was started and founded to basically do voter suppression to keep black people from voting because poor white people realized if black people have a right to vote, they have a right to power and they have a right to change things. They didn't want their white privilege and their white whatever, their white supremacy to go away. So they wanted to keep things the way they are. And by the way, if you read the doctrine of the KKK, they believe they're Christian, number one, which is really sick. But two, they're a white supremacist organization. They believe that white people are ordained by God to be God's chosen people. So this is white supremacy. And white people are coming up with this. They believe that black people were inferior because they believe they're the descendants of Ham. They believe in the Bible Ham was cursed, and therefore black people was cursed. Therefore they believe that black people deserve what they get. Okay? Which leads me to another point. What about the racism in the church, Voddie? What about Southern Baptists, which you talk about a little bit in your book? Well, the Southern Baptists were the Southern Christians living in the southern states who were in favor of slavery. Okay? They were in support of slavery. They also believed that slavery was an institution ordained by heaven. Okay? So what about the racism in the church, Voddie? What about the racism that we did to Native Americans, where we basically took away their names and we stripped them of their Native American, their garments and their outfits and what they wore, and we put white people clothes on them. And we basically said, in order to be saved, you got to do it like white people. Clear racism, Voddie. White supremacist, racist racism. White supremacy in the gospel. Okay? So what about the racism within the church? Here's a story that I just found out recently. The great preacher Jonathan Edwards, the guy who preached the sermon, sinners in the hands of an angry God. Do you know he bought slaves? And we know this because his slave receipt is actually in Yale University right now. And you can actually get on Google and you can read his slave receipt. Jonathan Edwards, the guy who preached, sinners in the hands of an angry God, he preached sinners in the hands of an angry God, and he bought a 14-year-old slave girl named Venus. So, Voddie, what about the racism within the church? You don't address that. You don't address that. So, until you address that, your research is horrible. I'm sorry, guys. Since there's no Bacon's Rebellion, there's no really talk about racism, and he mentions it, but he doesn't talk about racism in the church. He doesn't talk about how the church, we were part of the problem in all this. Okay, the American church is culpable. Okay, he doesn't talk about the Bacon's Rebellion. He doesn't talk about how white people invented whiteness. They did. He doesn't talk about how white people invented white privilege. They did. He doesn't talk about how white people invented white supremacy. They did. And he shares this in his book as if these are false lies. No, they're not. Voddie, this is the truth. And if you studied Bacon's Rebellion, it would show you all this. So my point, guys, to this is this. This is horrible scholarship. This is horrible, biased, unfair, unbalanced presentation, and quite frankly, horrible, horrible scholarship. And if you read Voddie Baucham's life, he's got many, many degrees, and he's now a dean of a professor in Zambia, Africa. Well, as a dean of a college, I'll be honest, I expect better than that from him. I really, really do. This is horrible scholarship. This is not good scholarship at all. And I, as a dean of a college, as a dean of a university, I expect better. I truly expect better. One of my last points, I'm getting to the end of it. He talks about how the problem in America really isn't about politics. He talks about the real problem is social justice versus biblical justice. Okay. Well, social justice, he defines that basically as neo-Nazism and socialism, okay? Well, hello, Voddie. Those are governmental regimes, therefore politics. So you just kind of contradicted yourself. Also, he doesn't say this in his book, but he says this in one of his videos when he's talking about his book. He says, critical race theory and social justice. Imagine if you had a big train, and on these trains you have racial tension, and you have homosexuality, and you have transgenderality, and then you have women's rights, therefore you have abortion, you have all these things that are on the critical race theory train, in the social justice train. And what he says is, critical race theory and social justice is the engine that makes that whole entire train go. So when he says politics aren't the problem, social justice and critical race theory are the problem. And I'm like, Voddie, your point is debatable at best. Because in my opinion, politics is the gasoline and the oil that make that engine go. Okay, so to use your analogy, if critical race theory and social justice are the engines, politics is the gas and oil that make it go. Particularly when you have Republicans that are basically, anti-gay marriage and anti-abortion, And Democrats are for all that, and they're for also transgenderality. So now you got the Democrats and Republicans coming against each other, and those two things and those two factions and those two parties are the oil that makes this thing run. Okay? And that's just the reality. And then unfortunately, you have churches that are now voting on their politics as opposed to voting on what they're supposed to be doing according to what the Bible says. And now you just have a whole hot mess that just stirs this pot even more. And oh, by the way, now that we're on politics, I'll talk about this real quick. He makes a statement in his book, which I think is very unfair. He says, well, nobody really votes just on one side. And he uses the abortion as his muse. He's like, nobody votes Republican just because of abortion. He's like, I've never met any one person who just votes one way because of one topic. And I'm like, Voddie, that might be true, but I know a whole lot of people who vote Republican on two topics, abortion and gay marriage. And they really don't care about anything else. They're going to vote Republican just because of gay marriage and abortion. So they might not vote one way because of one issue, but they will vote one way because of two issues. And the fact that you didn't cover that in your book is just a huge oversight on your part, or quite frankly, again, that's just lazy scholarship once again. And it's very unfair. It's very unfair. It's very unbiased because you're not really telling the full truth. Which again goes back to what a point I made earlier. This book seems to be written just for people who agree with you. It's like the people who agree with you, you're just throwing them a bone, and you're not covering any of this other stuff. With that being said, I want to get into, you came up against another fellow preacher, fellow pastor, Matt Chandler. I don't know everything that Matt Chandler says or does, but I watched a video that he was saying where he was talking about, really what he was talking about was James chapter 2, and he was talking about faith without works is dead. He was basically saying, if you preach the gospel, but if you don't live the gospel that you preached, then quite frankly, you're a hypocritical Christian, and the gospel's, I'm not going to say the gospel is in vain, but your gospel is insufficient. Now, a lot of you Reformed Christians got on Matt Chandler, and you got on him and said basically, he's not preaching the Bible anymore. He's preaching critical race theory, and he's basically a woke pastor, and he needs to be fired. And some of you are saying, well, how dare he preach that? Because again, he's preaching racism, and he just needs to focus on preaching the Bible. First of all, guys, he was preaching the Bible. He was preaching James chapter 2, faith without works is dead. And what he was basically saying is if you preach the gospel, but if your life does not resemble that gospel, then you're a hypocrite. That's what he was saying. Now, I say all that to say this. Saints, if you say, just give people the gospel, because this is the other point that Voddie Baucham does a horrible job on. Again, remember what he said earlier. He says the problem in America today is social justice versus biblical justice. Okay? Well, okay then, Voddie. Then give me the biblical justice response to racism. Give me the biblical justice response to George Floyd. Give me the biblical justice response to all this police brutality. Give me the biblical justice response to racism. Okay? And hello, even in the church. And from what I'm hearing in this book, what he's saying is, well, just give people the gospel. Just give them the gospel. Excuse me, Voddie, what gospel? The tainted, racist, white supremacist gospel that has been perpetuated in this country for 400 years? Because unfortunately, to Black and Native American people, that's what we gave them. That is historically what we gave them. So I agree with you. The gospel is the answer, Voddie, if and only if that gospel is pure. But unfortunately, it hasn't been pure. It's been tainted by white supremacist racial gospel. That's what we gave them, Voddie. And that's why Voddie Baucham and all you Reformed Christians, in my opinion, you really, really need, again, based upon, it was only a 3-minute excerpt that I saw Matt Chandler. I don't know of everything he's preaching. But in this one particular video, he was basically saying the gospel we gave them was insufficient because it was ripe with our own hypocrisy because we weren't living it. And some of you reformers got on there and said, see, how dare you, Matt Chandler, say that, saying the gospel is insufficient. He didn't say the gospel was insufficient. He said the gospel is good if we are living it. If we're not living it, then we're hypocrites, and therefore it's not sufficient because our hypocrisy may cancel some of it out. Now, I say some of it because, thank God, it's by the grace and the mercy of God that some Black people and some Native American people and Asian people even got saved at all. With our historical racist white supremacist past that was infused and mixed in with our gospel, it's by the grace of God that African Americans and Asians and Native Americans even got saved at all. So that's just a testament to the grace and the mercy and the power of his word. When Jesus said, when my word goes out, my word will not return unto me void, Jesus wasn't kidding. But my God, the fact that God, Jesus allowed racism and white supremacy in his gospel and people still got saved by it is the grace and the mercy and the just the power of God's word. But don't get it twisted, saints. We were hypocritical when it came to the race relations in this country. And we were part of the problem, just like the world was. The Christian church wasn't any better. And I got more and more stuff to talk about that, but I don't have time because this video is really, really getting long. But we were just as culpable as the world was. So, which is why when I read a review of this book, they said there's really no redemptive thing from this book. And I get why they're saying that, because they're basically saying, hey, if social justice isn't the answer and critical race theory isn't the answer, and you're saying biblical justice is, then show me biblical justice of how we can fix this. For instance, one verse would be the Good Samaritan. Good Samaritan, not in Voddie's book. Or what about Matthew 25? When I was naked, you clothed me. When I was hungry, you fed me. When I was in prison and you visited me. Okay? Where's Matthew 25 in his book? It's not in there. There's really no scriptures that talk about how we use Bible in the gospel of how we can fix these problems. And oh, by the way, what about the people who don't receive the gospel, Voddie? Does that mean they're outside of biblical justice? Therefore, we don't bring justice to them? Because we know not everybody's going to receive the gospel. So if the people who don't receive the gospel, what is their answer? Can they get justice just because they're not Christian? Or do we just forget about them because they didn't receive the gospel? So since the gospel is the answer, and since they didn't receive the gospel, then we just throw them to the wolves? That question is not addressed in his book either. So where's the end game for the political justice side of it? Voddie does a really, really bad job of that as well. Also, one last point, and I'll since I'm getting late, I'll leave it at this. He talks about the Constitution in the 3/5 of a person law. Okay, for those of you who don't know, that was basically the Great Compromise, where they decided, 3/5 of slaves will be counted for population, for the sake of electoral votes. And Voddie Baucham basically says, if you interpret that black people were 3/5 of a person, then you're ignorant because you're interpreting it wrong. Okay, so Voddie says 3/5 of a person means if you have 5 black people, only 3 were counted and the other 2 weren't. Okay, fine. To me, Voddie, that's semantics, because at the end of the day, number one, it's a racist law. It's racist in its constitution. And number two, does it really matter how you interpret it, Voddie? 3/5 of one person, or only 3 of 5 are going to be counted? Either way, it still plays out the same way. So to me, Voddie, this is a twisting of history just to try to make some point of how the Constitution wasn't racist, but it was racist. So you just invalidated your whole point. And honestly, Voddie, again, this is horrible scholarship. Even if people do interpret it wrong and they think they're saying 3/5 of a person is one person instead of 3 people were counted out of 5, fine. Either way, Voddie, it's racist, because the other 2 people you didn't count, you disregarded them as nothing. Okay? So it's still racist. Okay? This is a bad law. This is a racist law. And this is a racist law in the Constitution. Critical race theorists would have pointed it out and called you on your lack of scholarship all day long. And I'm saying that nicely. A critical race theorist would have called you out on that revisionist history. Okay? This is bad scholarship, guys. This is bad scholarship. And Voddie Baucham does that throughout his book a lot. Okay? So that concerns me, because there's a person here who writes like some forward and stuff on the back of it. And he says this. He says this: the weaving of the stories and the reporting with the solid and clear teaching is perfect. Fault lines is great. He says, I shall be required of all my students. And he's a professor at some, I'm not even going to say his name, or the seminary in which he teaches from. He says he's going to make this required reading of all his students. Again, there's some good stuff in here. There's some great stuff in here. There's also a lot of bad. And in my opinion, Voddie Baucham, because of his lack of research, and even the research he does have is very one-sided. It's very biased. It's not fair. It's imbalanced. And in some cases, just the lack of scholarship is just astounding. I mean, it's just really, really bad. And oh, by the way, he uses fault lines. That's the title. Because of all these things, Voddie, in my opinion, you are one of the reasons that the fault line exists. Because you're really not doing anything to bring the body of Christ together. You are creating a fault line by giving people a bone to people who agree with you. And you're not being fair to the definition of critical race theory and what it actually is. Laws and regulations in this country were used to keep black and brown people down. That is a fact. And it all started all the way back in the Bacon's Rebellion, which again, you don't cover in your book. Okay? So a lot of good stuff in here, a lot of bad stuff in here. And in my opinion, therefore, I give it 2 out of 5 stars. And if I were to give it a grade, I give it a grade of a C-. This is really not a great book, guys. It's unfair. It's imbalanced. Lacks research. There's a lot of things and there's a whole lot more of history in America I could talk about, but I don't have time. I'm at 45 minutes. Yeah, there's some claims in here that are just very, very, very one-sided. I give it a C-, 2 out of 5 stars. Not a great book. There's some great stuff in here, but overall, I got some issues with it. I really do. And I think this book is going to bring even more of a divide. It's not going to help. It's just going to tear us even more apart. I don't think this is a great, great book to bring people together. All it's going to do is bring people together that already agree with Voddie Baucham. And the people who don't, like me, I have some things I disagree with. It's just going to make us separate the camps. This is not bringing the body of Christ together. This is being divisive, and it's basically going to tear us apart even more. So this book doesn't help. In my opinion, it doesn't help. There's a lot of great stuff in here that opens your eyes, like the Black Lives Matter stuff and the abortion stuff. A lot of great stuff in there, but overall, it's not going to help. I don't think. So 2 out of 5 stars. I give it a C-. Please look at this video along with my other video I did before this, and I hope between the two of them, it brings some clarity to the issue. Until next time, God bless.